Good afternoon and welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangout. We're back after a nice hiatus and we have a lot to talk about. Craft 3 was recently released and we've got a long list of topics we'd like to get into. Today we're going to start off with Composer and Craft 3. As we all download Craft 3 and get involved in it, it has a whole new workflow and a lot of potential, but a lot of us using the platform are new to that workflow with Composer. So we'll get into that in a moment. This is Straight Up Hangouts, sponsored by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. I'm Ben Parisic from Barrel Strength and the Sprout plugin suite, and we have with us today Brandon Kelly from Pixel and Tonic. And welcome, Brandon.
Thanks.
How about we start with the basics? What is Composer?
Composer would be package manager built with PHP for PHP libraries. If you've used NPM at all for loading up Node or other types of JavaScript dependencies, it's very much like that, where there's various, like Peckle is another one for PHP, and for PHP like actual classes, and then there's the various Mac OS ones. There's lots of package managers out there. So Composer is basically the most popular one written for actual PHP code.
And these package managers, they help us manage dependencies between the various different packages out there. And when we say package, we mean kind of somebody created some PHP script that does something, and they felt it was containable enough in a unit that they would make a small unit that you could build into a larger product.
Right. It's basically the idea is that there's, no matter what you're developing, aspects of it, are just, establishes common problems, and rather than reinvent the wheel every time you're doing a new project, you might as well use something that someone else has already written. They can come in all different shapes and sizes, and like obviously with Craft 3, Craft itself is a package, and whether you're using Craft 2 or Craft 3, you're still using, Craft itself is a great example of a package. It's it handles a ton of different things, so it's a pretty large package, but you're not writing a website from the ground up with a raw PHP file anymore. You're using this prepackaged software to get you most of the way there, so that you can focus on what's unique to yours. So
that's one of the great things about Craft 2 was Craft has this meta level where it's an application, but it's also kind of written with itself. And if you're doing development with the platform, often examples of what you want to be doing are right there under the hood in the Craft folder, to understand how to do more advanced templating or more advanced plugin development and integrate with the system. So now in Craft 3, we have Craft being a package in its own ecosystem that you can build your website with Craft as a package and several other packages. That's also a very nice meta level to the system. What other packages is Craft using in its Composer setup?
So we use a ton.
Maybe some
the big
of them.
ones. The big one is Yi. So Yi is our framework that we use, and Yi is available as a Composer package. So from Craft's perspective, to include Yi, we're just basically saying in our little Composer config file that we require Yi to run this application. Yi has its own list of packages as well, so that it's all recursive. Another one would be Guzzle. We use Guzzle to create HTTP clients that we're able to, actually provide to other packages as well. So like another one would be if you're using the S3 functionality, which is provided by a plugin now. So that's also another package, but that requires Amazon's, S3 SDK, and when you when we instantiate that, we're actually passing this Craft-defined Guzzle client to it, so that any special guzzle configs you have within Craft are also applying themselves to S3. Twig is a package. We have a package for I don't know. There's tons and tons of stuff. Craft probably directly requires like 20 packages in order to run, and each of those have their own requirements in addition to that. So,
and now all plugins are essentially packages as well. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct. Yeah. So in Craft 3, we whether you're registering your plugin with Packagist or not, and Packagist is kind of like the primary repository for Composer packages. It's where Composer primarily discovers what's available for it and downloads new versions and all that kind of stuff. Even if you don't publish it there, to publish a plugin in the plugin store is its own Composer package repository as well. And so by being in the plugin store, you have officially now released a Composer package in one form.
So when we say Packagist is a repository, I know Packagist is when I release a plugin for Craft, I go up to I can go up to Packagist. Maybe we can draw a distinction of why Packagist is different in the plugin store in a minute. But I can go up to Packagist, I can register my GitHub repo and say, hey, this piece of code exists at this repo. I name it this, and there it's published on Packagist. So Packagist to me as a user is a website, but behind the scenes Composer is treating that website's data as a repository of information to know which packages are available to
right. So yeah, so as far as Composer is concerned, Composer needs to be configured with what it calls repositories. These are not necessarily the same thing as a Git repository, or not at all actually. It's more just a catalog of available packages defined through a JSON file or multiple JSON files. Composer actually, if you look at their documentation, they actually show you how you can create your own, private, JSON package repositories if you wanted to like use Composer for internal development within a private organization, and you can't publish these things live. So it's the syntax for defining these is relatively simple, and the primary function of packagist.org is to provide those JSON files. And then there's a website, and there's the submission process, and all these kinds of things that are basically just UI for managing those JSON files contents.
Okay. And we will get into some examples of what this looks like in code and creating a Craft project shortly. For the moment, let's kind of stay at this meta level. Now, you said Craft, the plugin store the plugin store is not the same as Packagist. So but they kind of do the same thing. So yeah, what is the distinction, and does a plugin developer even need to publish something on Packagist? What benefits are there to doing so?
Yeah, so as far as their relationship, basically the plugin store, as far as Composer is concerned, the plugin store looks like just a Packagist alternative. The JSON files that it provides look very similar to the types of files that Packagist provides. And when you're installing something within the plugin store, within Craft, it's basically loading up an internal copy of Composer, and before running anything, it configures Composer to look at our plugin store JSON stuff rather than Packagist's JSON stuff. So, but then it executes regular Composer functions in very, very much the same way that you do from the terminal if you ever use that. So they're, as far as like the Composer specific implementation, they're very similar. If you go to packagist.org/packages.json and take a look at that, and then compare that with composer.craftcms.com/packages.json, you'll kind of see like that's the interface that Composer uses, is that starting point. And then what was the second part of your question?
I get, is there any benefit to plugin developers publishing their package onto Packagist as well, since you're already handling it? without
Yeah,
updating.
so technically, no, there's no need to do that. If you're publishing in the plugin store, um, the only reason you might also want to publish on Packagist is if you want to support people being able to install your plugin from the command line.
So
And
and
even then, they could technically still install from the command line by tweaking their composer.json file and telling it to use our thing instead of packagist.org, which is the thing that the plugin store does automatically behind the scenes. In which case, there's no benefit. But if you want to give people the ability to just without making any changes to composer.json to go into their terminal and type composer require and then your package name, if you want that to work, then you have to have it on Packagist as well. That's really the only benefit.
Okay, great. So Composer then is a very flexible piece of software in itself that you were able to take and reuse a lot of its functionality to build your own kind of craft ecosystem package manager that we all get to use in the plugin store and enjoy the benefits of through things like the one-click checkouts or installations and updates within the craft control panel.
Yeah, I mean, as far as craft goes in that equation, it's basically you're just craft is always running Composer to install and update things and to remove plugins as well. The only difference is like whether you're doing it from the terminal, then you're interacting with your system's installation of Composer, and if you're doing it from the control panel, then you're interacting with the Composer package that we've actually included within Craft, and we've created a nicer UI for it than the terminal, perhaps. But that's about it. It's the same thing under the hood.
Great. So then I think Craft attracts a lot of designers because it's well designed and gives them a lot of flexibility to succeed at what they want to do. Often they're less familiar with development and their skill sets might not cross over into the command line and certain commands with Composer and whatnot. What do you feel the average Craft user needs to know about Composer? Do they even need to know the word to use Craft? I know we now see as we're updating, it says Composer is updating stuff. When we see that now and then, an error might occur. And in general, I feel the error messages when things go wrong installing plugins are a little more developer. You might need to be a little more of a developer to make sense of what they're even saying to you. How do you think of the average user in Craft using Composer?
I mean, I think it's probably split pretty much down the middle in terms of people that appreciate the Composer stuff and people that would rather not ever see the word Composer and have to worry about what it is or worry about terminal commands and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, our hope is that we'll be able to get to a point where we're minimizing the times where Composer surfaces itself in the form of an error or anything like that. Part of it is just, we've got to figure out ways to be smarter about conflicts before they occur when trying to install things. Part of it's going to be, working with plugin developers to make sure that people are making plugins that are as cross-compatible with other plugins as they possibly can. And then, depending on how things go, it's still, Craft 3 has only been out for a little over 2 weeks so far, so it's hard to say how things will shake out at this point. But, the other thing we're considering is if it ends up being just a big deterrent and people, really reject the Composer thing at a large scale, then, the next step would be considering like how can we actually divorce Craft the client from Composer internally and move more of the Composer operations off to a web service where we can more tightly control how that stuff works and not have the Craft client run Composer itself in the first place. It's another direction we might consider going, but for the people that don't want it. But so far seems like in general people are being pretty successful with it, whether they care about Composer or not. So so far we're looking like things are pretty good.
Yeah, I find myself and my whole team, we've been struggling with it in various ways, but we've also been succeeding in many ways. And after you kind of get familiar with the common things you run into with it, you realize it's fairly straightforward, the commands you do need to run or do need to do. We're often working with plugins more than just building a simple craft site. But even towards the end of this, we'll take a look at a few things you can do with Composer to build your scaffolding for your craft site and really customize your workflow. So it adds a lot of potential there for some exciting things as well.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's take a look at some code. So for the next part of this, I'd like to explore how do we use Composer in a craft project, and then after the projects, we can take a look at how would we be using Composer in our craft plugins.
Taking a look at my code or your code?
Oh, I've got code. I've got it here. Just finding the share screen button.
All right.
Great. Unless you brought a presentation, I'm all ears.
No.
All right. So now we're in the installations instructions on the doc. Right after step 0, we have install Composer, and so we can check on our system if Composer is installed, and if it's not, we get to install it, and if it is, we can update it to the latest. Now, these instructions are for in our local development environments, we install Composer. Do the servers we have that are running Craft also need to have Composer installed?
No, they shouldn't need to, because once you have Craft present, keep in mind Composer is packaged inside of Craft. So once you have Craft present, to run self-updates and all that kind of stuff, it's just going to use the copy of Composer that's already bundled with it.
Okay.
And in fact, if you can actually, you slid past it, but if you don't have Composer installed and you don't want to, it's worth mentioning that as of April 4th, when Craft 3 GA launched, we actually do provide a zip file on craftcms.com that would let you just skip the Composer installing altogether and go straight to getting the files that it's supposed to give you. So
nice. Well, that's good to know. I skipped right by it.
Yeah.
All right, so let's take a look at, I've got a simple directory structure here, and I'm just going to drop down to the command line and start poking around on it. When we interact with Composer, it creates our project's kind of managed by this composer.json file, which defines what we do with the project. So here's a default craft CMS. This is the composer.json that you provide in your default setup. So when we look at this, it tells us a few things. It gives us a name of the project and description. It tells us the license. It gives us some support information. Down here is where it starts to get into the details of what it's doing.
Yeah, I should say this file that you get by default is a little awkward because when you go the Composer create project route, Composer projects are kind of this awkward hybrid package where half of it is like it is a Composer package just like any other, but it's a specialized package that's meant to be used as a starting point for a new project. And so the composer.json file that's inside it, it's kind of half there to define that package and communicate information about that package to the Composer ecosystem. And then also half of it's there to just be your starting point for your new project. So if you scroll up in here, like the name, where you see like the name is craftcms/craft, that's not something like you could just safely delete that. Like that's there for the purpose of defining this project in the Composer ecosystem. Same thing with description, same thing with keywords, same thing with license and homepage and type and support. It's really not until you get down to the require that this file starts defining things that are actually relevant for your project, as opposed to the composer package that you used as a starting point to get this.
Mm-hmm. And so let's run this, and well, let's run what's in the docs first, and then we can kind of backtrack and explore. So I have it a line already here. So we're running this create a new project script. So if I can create composer, create project, craft CMS/craft, and I want to put that in the default project folder. And now composer and create project are the composer command. Craft CMS/craft is actually telling composer to look for a Packagist project. Is that right? Or
it's telling it to find a package with the name craft CMS/craft, which it's going to find on Packagist.
Okay, so we have the GitHub repo here on your craft CMS repo, craft CMS craft. But if we go to the Packagist website and search for craft CMS craft, we'll also find that, and that's what composer is looking to find.
Right. So it's you're basically create project is composer's command for saying download a package by the following name, and then once you've downloaded it, run composer install on that package with whatever comes down. It's basically create project is basically a shortcut for those two commands, saying download this package and then run composer install on that package. So
right.
And then the third argument you put in there is where should I download this package? So you're telling it, download the craft CMS/craft project package into a folder called default/project.
All right, and I have opened my file system here, so we'll see that get created right here in tandem with the command line. Some of us that are less comfortable on the command line, I think, always enjoy kind of seeing that there's something familiar happening.
Sure. Yeah. So there it goes. So now it's downloading everything, and then it's finished, and now it goes into the post install setup command that we have, setup/welcome command that we have running.
Great. Yeah, and so you tell us to then run this to set up the project. I'm not going to do that here. That's kind of the next step of getting everything set up, but we're going to stay focused on Composer. So that's nice. And I guess if we look at this Composer file, we'll see that same one that I was looking at earlier that was downloaded from the Git repo, and that's what it does. Now, the reason I downloaded the other one is I wanted to switch over and say, what if you just had the Composer file? So if we switch over and to the craft project, what is it? I'm doing wrong. Oh, it's just right. So here we're in this folder with the craft project and the Composer file, and with the Composer file, I can run composer update, and it's just going to run. It's just going to look for a composer.json file and run it. And when it does that, it actually installs a lot of the same stuff. However, it doesn't give us all the project files. So that first command we ran from the craft docs gives us a whole craft project. If we just run the composer command itself, it just gives us the things in the vendor directory.
Right. Yeah. The whole point of going through the project is because you wanted to have the same starting point. Like you wanted all those project-specific files. Really, the only thing that's super relevant about the composer.json file that it comes with is the fact that it says it requires the craft CMS/CMS package. That's the only real relevant thing in there. And it's that one requirement that ends up, giving you all the other ones, all of the recursive dependencies of Craft, in addition to Craft itself.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this folder structure that we get back. So what in this folder structure do we have Composer to thank for? Some of this is project-related stuff that Composer pulled in, but what in this folder structure really relates to what Composer knows about or cares about?
Yeah, the only thing that Composer added is the composer.lock file, and the composer. So composer.json is basically like that's where you have defined your general project requirements. For example, yours might say that it requires at least Craft 3.0.0. Now, there's a lot of different, Craft releases that could match that version requirement. In this case, you probably got 3.0.3.1, which is the latest release. So composer.lock is where Composer goes in and after installing things, takes a record of what it actually installed. So if you search for craftcms/cms in here, there you go. So that's like, now you can see it's logged that it's specifically installed 3.0.3.1 and any additional information that Packagist might have told it about that package at that version. So most of this data you're looking at here is actually copied from Craft's composer.json file, just as a way to kind of hard code that. In addition to like these reference things are it remembering specifically which git commit hash that version mapped to at the time. That way, if we go back and for whatever reason decided to like retag 3.30.3.1 with a different git commit, even if the version number hadn't changed, the fact that that Composer stores the git commit here means it should be smart enough to realize like, oh, well, even though the version's the same, like I do need to reinstall this thing because it looks like something has changed about it. So this is just kind of where it keeps track of exactly what it should be installing. The main point of this file is so that if you're working on this project with other people, you can commit it to the repo that you're working on. And then other people, instead of running composer update, they can run composer install. And that basically tells Composer to just look at the lock file and just install exactly the same things that the other guy has installed.
Okay.
Or the other gal. And then the other thing that Composer does is it'll create that vendor folder. And the vendor folder is where everything actually goes. So that's where all the packages end up living, is inside this vendor folder.
So we see Craft CMS got pulled down and the CMS package here that we targeted got put in here. And it looks like you also have a couple other packages that you folks have designed for managing other things that we might not see as much.
Right. Yeah, and then like if you installed any first-party plugins, they would end up alongside there.
So let's talk about that real quick. So when we manage a Composer project, we get this vendor folder at the project level. However, each of our plugins has Composer dependencies that may also need a vendor folder. So when the
plugins themselves, the way to think of it is that everything is a dependency of your project, either directly or indirectly. And as far as Composer is concerned, it's just worried about what is the total unique list of packages that are needed to get this application project running as a whole. And it'll just install everything alongside each other. So you only get one vendor folder. If you install a plugin, you're going to find that plugin shows up in the vendor folder right alongside other dependencies. If the plugin has dependencies itself, those dependencies are also going to get loaded in alongside other dependencies. If two things require the same dependency, then Composer is just going to find a version that satisfies both of the requirements, and it's just going to download it one time. So it's vendor folder is basically, this is the place where like all of the third-party code that's required to get your website or your application working, this is where it all ends up living.
Okay, great. And so yeah, even though this has a vendor that, you know, if this was the base of the project, we might see a vendor folder in this, but it's not our main project, just the composer. So we get everything aggregated. Now, what of these files that we have here, we have our composer.json, our composer lock, and our vendor folder are the primary things used by Composer. Do we add any of these to the gitignore, and why?
Yeah, so our default project is going to tell it to gitignore the vendor folder because, you know, one of the nice things about Composer and having everything stored in composer.lock is that you can you know, use a deployment workflow and you know, collaboration workflow where you don't have to muck up your Git repository with a bunch of third-party code. It doesn't mean you have to go that route. If you're comfortable with having everything get committed to Git, that's fine. But I think a lot of people would prefer to not have these gigantuan commits that are just basically like, you know, the result of running Composer update. They'd rather have those commits result in like one single changed file that just tells composer.lock, you know, what the new versions and what the new Git commits and all that kind of stuff. It should be loading.
So if I download the craft zip file that doesn't require me to know much about Composer, does it exclude the vendor folder?
Yeah, I believe it would.
So, and I guess I ask that because if I'm unfamiliar with Composer and I'm deploying my website from my local environment to a server, if I have this vendor folder excluded, it's not going to get sent to the server. So I'm going to have to take some additional step that gets all of these dependencies for the craft project installed on the server as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, our general recommendation would be to start working out a deployment process where that part is automated and in a way where you don't have to commit the vendor folder anymore. Just because it leads to cleaner commits and, you know, keeps your repository size way down, makes it easier to deploy changes. You know, and there's a lot of nice services out there. Like, I don't know if you've looked at, you know, buddy.works, you know, even deploying to, you know, things like Amazon, you know, their AWS services, like, you know, automatically run composer install if it detects a composer.json or composer.lock file.
So is this handled by the deployment tool that we choose? We deploy from a tool and then we have to run a command after it, or we have to configure the server to know when it receives?
The modern stuff is all automated. So the idea is you can create a workflow where you're committing your changes, and as soon as it hits a master branch, then GitHub notifies the deployment tool about it, which, you know, either downloads everything and runs Composer install itself, and then pushes the results up to your production box, you know, or your production box is actually capable of running the Composer install command itself, depending on, you know, who you're hosting with. And, you know, it just see, like, what we found is that the trend is that most modern deployment setups these days have ways to do this. And so, you know, even if you don't want to install Composer locally, there's still a pretty good chance that that your host or your deployment process would have a way to support this sort of workflow for pushing things to production. So we just figured, you know, it's you know, it's not, you know, just because you don't want it running Composer locally doesn't necessarily mean you don't like Composer at all. It just means you don't want to deal with it on your local machine. If you do want to commit your vendor folder, then you delete this line from gitignore, you know, and then you're done. And then you go right back to working on things the way that you may have done it with Craft 2.
So when I pull my colleague's repo and the vendor folder is excluded the first time, I have to know that I have to run composer install to get everything set up locally, or my website's not going to be loading properly.
Yeah.
Let's say we then work on things for a month and install a plugin here and there. When do I pull the code again and need to know that I need to run composer install or composer update locally in order to have the most up-to-date stuff?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's like there's definitely ways that you can do that through scripts where just hook into the get pull hook and automatically run composer install locally as well. Internally we just get in the habit of running composer install after get pull, and that seems to work just fine. But there's certainly ways you could automate it if you're working on a team where this is just a common thing you have to run into.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Good. Well, that clarifies, I think, a lot of the details around what these different things do. So the next little thing I wanted to demo is, the first command we ran here was very nice. I want to get set up with a craft project, so I'm going to call composer create project craft CMS /craft and what folder I want to start it in. Craft provides us a nice overview of how they structure a default project. However, you folks also cater to thousands of users who all do things slightly differently. So I'm sure in this thing, you've made your best generalist, best practice assumptions about how things are structured, and then several of us that pool are going to say, well, we really want to do this every single time when we have a craft site, but let's do it a little bit differently. So what's neat about this command, this create project command, is that you can create your own GitHub repo just like Craft has, and create your own base project to whatever spec you would like. And it's actually fairly simple to do. We've been working on one, updating our Craft master, but the one I wanted to demo was NY Studio 107, Andrews. He's doing some neat things in his. He's got a craft web, and he says conveniently at the, or truly at the top, he's making a lot of assumptions that are specific to his project. So if you're copying this, they might not fit your use case. He's using a JavaScript framework he likes and a CSS framework he likes, and these may change from each of our situations. So I'm going to run quickly his script here. So where am I? If I'm now calling composer create project NY Studio 107 craft, and then I'll put it in a custom project folder. Now, again, his repo is on GitHub here at NY Studio 107 craft, and if we go to Packagist and search NY Studio 107 craft, it's got to be specific. We're probably going to find that particular repo here somewhere. And so this is where I guess Composer talks to this and then gets it from GitHub. So, so if we run this, we go through that same kind of pull everything down into our local folder setup. We get the final message that says craft is ready to go, but you have to do another thing or two. And then he's also added a little more information saying, well, if you want to use my specific project, you also have to run these other things in order to get everything configured correctly. So I won't go into detail of his project or anything that he's doing with it, but it's a great example of a lot of different things you could do with your own setup.
Yeah, it's really cool.
All right. Now I wanted to touch on one more thing. I guess I'll touch on it here. I think I'm wondering if it's more plugin related or kind of project related. So the question is, the composer files we have default to a minimum stability of stable. And so I've got an article here that is what am I doing? Here's an article. So composer packages have a concept of, is the package stable or not stable or totally fresh and might have lots of bugs. And when we create a composer package, a composer JSON file, you don't see minimum stability here, but it's assumed that minimum stability is equal to stable. Now, if you've been
that's the default value, yeah.
Yeah, and if you've been part of the Craft beta leading up to Craft 3, you know we were often trying to pull in a release candidate or a beta version of the plugin or the CMS itself. Now, now that we've moved into Craft 3 being stable, we still have a lot of plugins in the ecosystem that are in beta or moving through these levels. What's worth knowing about stability as a user?
Yes.
Are you able to install a beta plugin in your stable Craft site or a dev plugin in your stable Craft site?
Yeah, so the important thing to know about this minimum stability config setting of Composer is it only applies to your dependencies. So if you tell Composer you want to install a beta version of Craft or of a plugin, and you're explicitly telling it, like, install this version at this beta, stability flag, then it doesn't matter what your minimum stability config setting is set to. It's going to take take your word for it that you want that version of it. So the only time this really applies is like if you install a plugin which itself requires let's say a beta level stability level dependency. In that case, it will check back with your minimum stability setting, make sure that that allows a beta dependency to be installed, and if so, it'll let it go through, and otherwise it'll give you an error about it. So as long as as long as the thing that's beta is in your project's require object within composer.json, then it's not going to, this setting doesn't come into effect. It just lets it go in.
Okay. So if if you were requiring Guzzle for Craft CMS, and the version of Guzzle you wanted was beta, as long as it's in your Craft CMS Composer JSON, it's fine. But if it, or no, it's not fine. Well, if this was stable, a beta dependency to Craft wouldn't be fine. And you could either solve it by making your minimum stability of the project beta, or you could solve it by actually adding that dependency here, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like the only like practical thing advice I can give as far as this stuff goes is if you're writing a plugin that is going to be published on the plugin store, just avoid anything but stable dependencies. And if you do that, then you'll be fine. Because you don't want to expect every single one of the people that are going to use your plugins to have to go into their Composer JSON and change and add this config setting. So
got it. All right. All right. So then let's move on to Composer. Let me check the back channel here. If you are viewing this and you do have a question, feel free to post a question to the back channel in Craft Slack, and I'll try to keep an eye on that and check it from time to time. All right, so next up we have Composer for plugins. We're kind of moving through this. Craft is using Composer for its ecosystem. When we build our Craft project, we use Composer to manage it. And now when we're building our plugins, we need a Composer JSON file in our plugins folder. So I was just going to pull up one of our plugins. We're skilled at causing Brandon trouble with our Composer workflows, and so let's just say we have Sprout Forms has a Composer JSON file. So I guess, Brandon, you touched on this earlier but it applies probably to say it again here that everything in here isn't composer specific. Some of it is craft specific.
Yeah, I mean, there's an extra property down at the bottom that you're supposed to put in if you're doing a craft plugin. And everything in there is going to be, you're specifically defining things for craft's benefit, not necessarily composers. That said, it's still read by composer to a degree. If it's in composer.json, then you're basically, this is the file where you define your package's composer config. And craft actually has a composer plugin, which is so composer itself has its own little like plugin API. And in order to install plugins and install them in a way where craft can identify what plugins are installed, craft actually has a composer plugin, which is one of those things that shows up in the vendor/craft CMS folder called, I think, plugin-installer. And if you look at the top of your plugins composer.json, you'll find that one of the things you're defining is that its type is called craft-plugin. And our composer plugin, the thing that's in that plugin installer folder, basically that tells composer, hey, anytime you're installing a plugin or you're installing a package whose type is set to craft-plugin, notify me because I need to do some custom stuff for that thing. And the custom stuff it needs to do is basically read out the values from that extra config, and then save them in a PHP file that Craft references later, which is going to be available at craftcms/plugins.php, which
yeah. So here, I guess I don't see that on the file, the initial project we just generated, because there's no plugins maybe, but in my development site we do have it here.
Yeah, it doesn't show up until you have at least one thing. So if you open that up, you'll see that it's almost like our own little version of composer.lock, but it's a PHP file. But the point of it is so that we can create this centralized place, the centralized index of all of the composer packages that you have installed in your project, whose type is set to craft-plugin, and we're just kind of storing like the critical information that we need about those plugins in a way where we can reference them within Craft quickly. So, like basically, it would be very inefficient if you were to run crafting, and every time Craft needed to find out about the installed plugins, if it had to go through and just parse your vendor folder and go into every single package and just sniff them and see, does this look like a Craft plugin? Does it not? It would be pretty inefficient. And so the solution we've got is that, like, as you're installing the package, we have this composer installer plugin, or plugin installer plugin, that kind of creates this this centralized index of what plugin packages you have installed.
And so this gets updated when you install a plugin and when you update a plugin?
Correct, yes.
And I so, think, go on.
No, I was just going to say, and so this is kind of where a lot of the values in that extra config array will end up getting stored. It'll remember the version and the plugin's name, and just kind of anything that it thinks it's going to need to know about your plugin at a high level.
And in a moment, we're going to look at how to manage a composer repository locally as a symlink. But one, I think, important thing to note if you're a plugin developer about plugins.php is that sometimes it doesn't get updated. And this isn't a general problem for, I think, the average user. It's more of a plugin developer problem. So can you speak to when this? Maybe we'll just speak to it when we're talking about symlinks.
Yeah, we'll have to get into the path repository type thing first. Okay. But
Okay. Let's just note it as, be aware that it doesn't get updated if you're using path repositories, and we'll look at that in a moment. Okay. All right. I guess then before we jump into that example, I wanted to ask, what So you've got folks like me out there that are just a danger to your danger to your whole ecosystem, pushing things that we were just learning in Composer and Craft to you, and you have to field all these things on your end and make a seamless, beautiful user experience for Craft users. What are you doing to? There's a few things that I've run into. I accidentally tagged a plugin differently than I had so my composer.json had one plugin release number, but my tag that I pushed to GitHub had a different number. We've had issues where we accidentally rebase our repo and change the hashes of the tags that we're pushing to you. What are you doing on your end to prevent against errors from us plugin developers, or preventing mistakes, trying to help us understand how you're preventing mistakes that we're making for you?
Yeah, I mean, in general, we're trying to create a system that's just as forgiving as it can be. We're not there yet. There's definitely, we're running into bugs here and there, and we're trying to figure out why they occur and what we can do to make things a little bit more gracious. But yeah, like as far as the version mismatch goes, Packagist has the same problem, where if a new tag is created on your Git repo and it has one version number, but then we download your composer.json file at that version, at that tag, and it's saying that it's a different version number. We don't want to give one of them a say over the other. They both to us are kind of equally important. So if there's a mismatch, then we just ignore it, basically. We have a little console application where we can go in and manually try and add update plugins and things like that, update a record of plugins, and from there we'll actually get a specific error outputted explaining why it skipped a version or why it skipped a tag. And we need to make that process more transparent, for sure. So if we happen to get one of those, like getting to a point where we could just send an email out to the developer automatically saying, hey, just so you know, this looks like you just pushed this tag, but we ignored it because of this. That would be really nice, for sure.
I think the general rule of thumb that you folks have told me is if your system hasn't processed it in 5 minutes or so, it's likely I've done something wrong and should reach out. And
ask. I mean, it's all usually pretty much automatic, and happens almost instantly. The GitHub will immediately tell us that your plugin just received a new tag. A tag was just created, and then we'll immediately add it to the queue that we need to reprocess this plugin. The queue is usually empty, so that'll immediately get processed, and all these API requests are pretty quick. We just do a quick API request, say, hey, GitHub, tell us about all the different tags that this plugin has and the hashes that they use, and start going through those, cross comparing what GitHub's saying about the plugin versus what our records show. Delete any versions that don't seem to exist anymore, add versions that are new. It's all generally pretty responsive and pretty quick and usually pretty reliable. So if it's been more than a couple minutes, then there's probably something. If it's still not showing up in the plugin store, then there's probably something that went wrong.
Got it. Yeah.
The one thing that can take longer is if your plugin has a bunch of new dependency requirements. Like let's say, a new version of some dependency that you're using comes out and you need a feature from it, so you update your composer.json file to say you require this new version of this dependency. If that's a new version of the dependency that no other plugin at any version has required yet, then in addition to updating your plugin, we'll also need to update our records of that dependency, which just ends up being one more thing that gets added to the queue after the fact. And so there's like a chance that your plugin might show up in the store with the updated version number right away, But if you were super eager about updating, then you might end up hitting some kind of composer error because we hadn't actually gotten through to updating all the plugins dependencies yet.
Mm-hmm.
And we've, that's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's an obvious problem, but the solution ends up being pretty complicated, and we haven't quite figured out the right way to deal with it yet.
Got it.
So
yeah, there's another version dependency challenge that we ran into once already. Was we were using the PHP League CSV dependency League CSV, and Josh Crawford was also using it in one of his plugins, but we both had two different versions of it. So ours, we hadn't updated from 0.7 and or 7 or 0.7, I guess, and his was at 0.8. And so anybody who's kind of whoever got installed on somebody's system first won, and whoever tried to install the other plugin lost, because you get an error saying the dependencies couldn't get resolved. So
and that's like, so it's hard especially with those like pre-release, like the O dot whatever plugins, because you don't really know. It's hard to know how open-ended you should make your requirement. Like it very well may be that there were breaking changes between the 0.7 and an 0.8, because anything O dot anything, usually, it's considered kind of pre-release, and breaking changes are accepted, or they're not as frowned upon as a breaking change would be between 1.0 and 1.1 kind of thing. I mean, in general, I guess I'll just say, like, try and, like, when you have a dependency, especially if it's not a pre-release, especially if it's like at least 1.0, try to just figure out, like, what's the earliest version that added the feature that I'm using from this thing, and then, like, try and kind of require anything from that up to the next major version, but not including that, and that'll kind of make it as compatible with other plugins as possible.
Let's discuss that briefly here. So I guess in my case, it was one of our plugins had a dependency where 7 was the prevailing one, and the other one had a dependency where 8 was the prevailing. And actually the version 9 is out, but when we tested it, it didn't work for some reason. So we ended up agreeing that we'd both update to the 8 range. So
I guess, like, if you're using the caret, then 7.2, and or I guess, okay, because the major version is changing, right? So basically, when you do that caret 8.2.0, you're saying we will accept anything greater than or equal to 8.2.0 up to but not including 9.0. So up to but exclusive 9.0.
And in our plugins, we want to try to be as flexible as we can there to play nicely with everybody else.
Yeah, and you can take a look at the source, and there's a chance that they released 9.0 because of some specific breaking change, but that breaking change doesn't actually affect you in any way. And if that's the case, you can actually tell it, you can have this, and then you could also say, like, or caret 9.0.0, and then basically you're telling Composer, like, I'm not comfortable with 10 yet because that hasn't been released, and I don't know what the implications of that will be, but I know that, like, I'm basically compatible with anything that's 8.x or 9.x. You could kind of say that, and that way you're making your plugin as compatible as you can across the plugin store with other plugins that might come out needing the 9.x version.
So it would be nice if we had kind of a little more visibility in what plugins use the same things at times. I think we'll get a knowledge of it as things come up. So now I know if I plan to update this, I should probably ping Josh and be like, hey, are you planning to update as well, or something?
Yeah, giving plugins visibility, that would be a nice feature on our end, would be to get some kind of report saying, like, here's, just so you know, here's the 10 plugins in the plugin store that your requirements are currently conflicting with, compared to these other ones. Like that's definitely something we could look into.
Or kind of like plugins in the ecosystem are generally using this version of this as a standard. So you should consider, consider yourself behind if you're behind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we ever want to like encourage plugins to be using older versions of dependencies. We always want everyone to update if possible to newer things, just because they're newer things are where the security fixes happen, and the performance fixes and all that kind of stuff is always on the more recent versions.
So in our plugins then, so we just discussed this caret here. This says we can do anything above this major version up until the next major version.
Right.
And now if I remove this, I'm telling Composer that I only want this specific version as an option.
Yeah, so that would be the thing to definitely avoid, because you're basically going to be playing hardball with anything else that wants that same package. Unless they happen to accept that exact same version, then Composer is going to have an error, because it's just not able to resolve. It's going to say, hey, well, I want to install this one Sprout plugin which requires 8.2.0, but I also want to require this other thing that requires at least 8.3.1, and there's no version there's no version of this CSV package that satisfies both of those. So I just can't do anything.
Now, if I was managing my Craft project and I wanted to require a specific version of Craft, is that a smarter or dumber thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, like, as far as the project goes, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want there. Because you don't have any reason for your project to play nice with other projects, So the only time that any of this really matters is if you're talking about a composer.json file for a distributed package, such as a plugin. On a project level, yeah, be as strict as you want. The other thing too is like projects are the places where you would actually commit your composer.lock file. So even if you had really lenient requirements in your composer.json file, because you'd be theoretically committing your composer.lock file, like that's extremely strict down to the commit hash, for every single dependency and their recursive dependencies. And that's worth mentioning too, is like if you're releasing a distributed plugin package like a plugin, it is not advised to include your composer.lock file in the Git repo. You usually want to gitignore that. It doesn't hurt to have it, but it's also, you should be aware that it's going to be ignored by everyone, by every Composer install, because Composer only looks at the top, like project level composer.lock file. All
right. Now I wanted to, in one more case, the Craft CMS Composer package, composer.json. Getting them all mixed up. You folks use the tilde a lot.
Yes.
Can you explain why you'd choose that over the caret in many cases? Or
yeah, it's, in our case, it's just we want to have a little bit tighter of control over what versions of dependencies show up. This is one of those things like do as we say, not as we do. In general, your plugins dependencies should be looser, should use the caret, not the tilde. In our case, like the best cases for why we do it are some certain things like Yi, for example, which doesn't strictly follow Semver. Like they'll have breaking, a significant amount of breaking changes even in their like, between 2.0.14 and 2.0.15, there will be some breaking changes and there'll be an upgrade guide. So we need to make sure that like, you're not allowed, that Composer is never going to automatically install 2.0.16 without us being the ones to explicitly say that's okay, and have a chance to kind of prepare our code for that.
So what does the tilde say? It doesn't allow you to go up to the next major version. It's constraining more on a minor version or a patch.
It's like the tilde, or it's like the caret, except that instead of preventing you from going up to or past to the next major version, it's more granular. So like if we have if we look at the league/fly system, I guess, tilde 1.0.35, that's saying you can go up to, but not including 1.1. So it can go up to 1.0.99, 1.0.150, as far up as they want to take that 1.0.x, it'll let you go there. But as soon as 1.1 comes out, that's like where it'll draw the line and say, no, I'm not going to go to that part until they've updated composer.json for that. And that's why if you look at like that one compared to like the yesoft/ye2, where we actually have 4 digits, 2.0.15.1. In that case, we're telling it you can go up to 2.0.15.99 or however high they want to take that, but you can't go to 2.0.16. So it's kind of just like, it kind of means like you have the freedom to do whatever you want on the last digit in this requirement thing, but you can't change any other digits besides the last one.
Got it. So going to 4-digit constrains their 3rd digit in the ye case for you there.
Yeah. Then, we're extremely specific with the composer requirement. You can see at the top, composer/composers set to 1.6.3. The reason for that is that, because we actually use composer to update Craft, in the event that composer were to need to update itself to 1.6.4 or whatever comes next that we want to update to, we were concerned that like in the process of composer updating itself, it might end up like running into some kind of like PHP error, because like half of the classes that were loaded were the old version, half of them are the new version, and maybe those aren't compatible with each other. So anytime we update composer, we actually also update a class map of all the composer classes that we think we're going to need to run in order to update composer, if that makes sense. And so anytime we update composer, we have to like update that class map. And so therefore, we just need to be very, very strict about what version of composer you're getting.
Understood. Yeah. All right.
But otherwise, yeah, I mean, as far as plugins go, use the caret for the most part, unless you have a really good reason not to.
Sounds good.
And in your plugin or your projects as well, generally you'll want to use the caret. Most things are going to follow Semver. Most things it's going to be relatively safe to say, hey, as long as it doesn't go up to the next major version, then I'm fine with just continuing to keep it updated. Okay. In something like Craft itself, we might, I guess like it kind of depends on the size of the project, like, because no packages, nothing in the world can actually follow semantic versioning to a T. A lot's been written about it, but I forget who wrote it, but there was like this GitHub gist thing that was posted, I think called it romantic versioning instead of semantic versioning. Because it's just there's this like romanticized idea of like of what it is, and it doesn't actually exist in reality. Every change that you make could be considered a breaking change to someone anytime you change behavior. In Craft itself, like there's the code base is so huge, and the number of use cases is so huge, and people use it for such a wide variety of things that it's literally impossible for us to make a major any kind of feature change or behavioral change anywhere without potentially breaking someone's workflow, or may have being interpreted as a breaking change to someone. So we'll try and do our best to follow Semver, for like things that we consider like, oh, this is like something that's gonna be the chances are everyone using this is going to need to modify their code at this point. But like when 3.1 comes out, for example, like, is there a chance that like people that are doing advanced things with SQL queries might need to update their code? Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that maybe something like that would need to be updated. So if you're concerned about that, if you're using, I guess the rule of thumb would be if you're using a package outside of what you would consider like the middle of the road intended use case for the package, if you're doing anything that's semi-fringe with it, you should consider locking down your version requirements a little bit more than normal. So instead of saying caret 3.0.0 for craft, maybe do a tilde 3.0.0. And that way, as soon as 3.1 comes out, it's going to require you to manually change that version requirement in order to get up to 3.1, and that way you have a little bit more of a chance to test your code again and all that kind of stuff before committing it.
Yeah, it's kind of like forcing Git commit conflicts rather than hiding them. bring them to the surface when you might need to resolve something between two things before it just happens on the live site and you don't notice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then let's go into the local path repositories topic. I think this is an important one for plugin developers who are developing locally. A lot of what we've looked at so far is Composer looking at Packagist and looking to Craft to bring in packages from public repositories. Now, when you're working locally, sometimes you have a big mess of code and you don't want to share it with anybody. You've got a lot of stuff to work out before you share it, and you want to do something with it. So I'm going to pull up my local environment for developing Sprout here. I have a handful of plugins in a Craft 3 project, and in the composer.json, we've added a repositories array. Mm-hmm. And I think we can look at the first one there later. So in this, we add a repositories array and then a path, type path, and then a URL to somewhere on my local computer that repository exists. And now when I run, and then I have to require that plugin just as I would anywhere else, and I can be as specific as I need to be or whatever I need to do here. But once I have it telling that I have a local location, and here when I run composer update, the first place it's going to look for my plugin isn't in the public repository, it's in my local path repository. So I guess I could try to pull a little demo of that off if we'd like. There's a couple other things I'll mention in here. You can also override the location of the Git repository. So when Craft Commerce went into beta, the folks at Pixel and Tonic gave people instructions to look at type VCS and Craft Commerce repo on GitHub. And when you ran Composer update in that case, it would pull down the repo from that location. And I guess this is maybe something better explained by you, Brandon. But at the end here, and I'm not even sure it's necessary. I think it was necessary at one point where I had a lot of things happening and I wasn't sure. I have the type composer repository where I've told it asset.packagist.org. Packagist itself is the thing. And I believe that's because when I run composer update locally, it's going to look through all of these locations for the things that I've required. And if it doesn't find them in my local path repositories, it's going to continue to look at Packagist. And if I don't put this last, it might look there first. So by putting this last, I'm more...
So Asset Packagist is actually unrelated to Packagist. That's a Packagist-like composer repository, like the Plugin Store is. And it's built by the Yi guys, and it's made for basically creating a bridge between Composer and JavaScript dependencies, like things that are on Bower and npm. Yi itself has some JavaScript-based dependencies, and they just decided they would rather do this as a packages route and load those in with Composer rather than bundle the JavaScript directly in Yi's code, which is fine. but it drastically slowed everything down, and it was unreliable. And so, so you actually don't need that anymore, because Craft, if you look at Craft's composer.json, we're actually like, we actually bundle all of those things into Craft now, and then we actually tell Composer that we provide all of those asset JavaScript packages. So if you keep scrolling down, there's an array called provide. There it is, and basically that's Craft telling Composer, hey, don't freak out when you don't know how to find these packages that don't exist on Packagist, because this package already provides that same code. Yeah, so basically, ever since we added that and started bundling those things directly into Craft, you don't need to have that assetpackages.org thing anymore. That's
all right.
That's something that was definitely needed back in the earlier days of the Craft 3 dev preview and the Craft 3 beta, but it is not needed anymore.
So then Packagist will just be looked at the end of, after it looks at whatever's in the repository.
Unless you can explicitly tell it to ignore Packagist with another one of these repos. You just I think that in that case you don't even give it a type. You just say packages.org as the key, and you set it to false. And that's kind of their way of saying, identifying that you don't want it to look at Packagist at all, that you want that completely disabled. But without that, yeah, like as a last resort, it will continue to check Packagist at the end of all this.
Okay. I have a comment from Oliver Stark, and correct me in chat if I'm wrong, Oliver, but I believe he's telling me I don't need to have all these crazy paths that I have. I just need to have one thing pointing to the plugins path, and it will look within those.
If that's the case, I had no idea, and that's awesome. I couldn't tell you.
He has a star at the end of, there's a star at the end of so it looks like it would be, does that look good, Oliver? All right. I think this is what it would be. I'd have to test that.
Cool. But yeah, I in my case, I mean, I don't know how you structure your things, but I've got like one dev folder. I've actually got like a dev volume on my that I created a partition for, and just everything is just living side by side. And a lot of that stuff is projects. Some of those are plugins that we're working on. Some, it's just all of those kinds of things. And so, the idea of telling Composer to try and read all of those directories and find the packages inside there would be a nightmare performance-wise. So I probably would stick with just listing all of the different ones out. But I guess if you just had a couple of things, then yeah, this would be a good way to go.
Yeah, in my case, I have all the Craft 3 plugins we do in a particular folder, so it could be a handy way to include all of that. That's kind of a separate discussion. I've flip-flopped a few project structures trying to solve different problems. So. All right, so that's the path repository. And let's take a look, I think, for the more visual people at the file system level of what happened. So when we installed our default project and we see the vendor folder, you'll see that all of the different things that got installed are the actual folders on my computer. And if we go to my vendor folder here, so I'm in my dev project vendor folder, barrel strength, you'll see that everything that's installed under the barrel strength folder is a symlink to another location, and that's this plugins Craft 3 folder where I kind of dump all of those things together. So, so if you do this and you run Composer update, you'll be able to see that it works by being able to see a symlink and being able to edit your file in a different location and see it affect the installation that you're working on.
Yeah, it's a really nice way to work on your plugins within the context of a actual Craft project, so that especially if you use something like PHP Storm, so you'll actually get the benefits of the IntelliSense and all the refactoring functionalities and all that kind of cool stuff. Everything just kind of works a lot better when it's able to load all of the code together as one big project, even if parts of the code are symlinked and actually technically editing things from a different location.
Yeah, it's great. So then I guess that to that end, now that we're managing everything with Composer, what happens when stuff goes wrong? And I know I've been in touch with you on this one, Brett. I did something and some dependency I have is out of sync with what I need it to be in sync with, and I need to fix it. So I think I don't think I'm the best person to speak to it, but I could at least make errors that we can correct here. So the vendor folder is something that we can just blow up whenever we want to blow it up. So if you run into problems and you don't know what you did and something just doesn't seem to be lined up right any longer, and you touched something but you're not sure what, you could just delete this vendor folder and rerun Composer update with your Composer file, and you'll get everything back in its default state.
Right.
So that's a very totalitarian approach of just, I don't know what I did, remove vendor folder, add it back. You can delete it manually or via Composer. Now, if you want to be more specific, so I guess maybe we can just review the commands here. So how would I remove the whole vendor folder if I wanted to? So
RM dash capital R.
So I'm in my default project here, and I'm just gonna
vendor.
Okay.
That's a recursive delete.
I've killed it, and now I can run Composer update, or would I choose Composer install because of the lock file?
Yeah, you have a lock file, so you could run Composer install. If all you wanted was to just get a fresh copy of vendor, it's going to be a lot faster to run Composer install if you have a Composer lock file. Because with the nice thing, like the reason that Composer update can take a while is that most of the work it's doing is trying to look at all of the dependency requirements that you have, that your dependencies have. It's doing all this recursive work, and it's trying to come up with like a single recipe of like the best case scenario for all of these dependencies, what the latest best version is that I can install that's not going to create a conflict with any other dependencies. And that dependency resolution can take forever because it's just looking at so much data and trying to come up with the best case. Whereas if you have a composer.lock file and you run composer install, then that's just telling Composer, hey, don't do any dependency resolution. Just look at the composer.lock file and install whatever that thing says to do. And then it might still do some sanity checks to make sure that the composer.lock file isn't telling it to do anything that's like illegal as far as its rules go. But it does take a lot of the guesswork out of it, and it just kind of knows exactly which git commit to download and all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot faster. That said, we kind of touched on this earlier, but there's like one of the big issues with path repositories is that Composer generally ignores path repositories when you run Composer update. And so if your plugin, which was installed through a path repo, if you change something about it inside its composer.json, so let's say you change your plugin's dependencies, or you change something in that extra config that Craft is supposed to store in that plugins.php file, anything in there that you change, when you run Composer update, it's not going to find those changes. And so what you probably want to do in that case is not simply delete your vendor folder and run Composer install. You probably want to explicitly remove the plugin and have Composer reinstall just that one plugin. Okay. And that usually gets around those sorts of issues.
So let me try to set up this path repository thing, and I might make a few errors here. So be ready to be on call. So first off, let me just start. I'm just going to try to include one plugin here. I added the path repositories array here. I'll move it up so we can look at them next to each other. And I've added our Sprout Reports plugin. So if this works now, I can type composer update. And everybody out there, I know I can do this via the command line as well. I'm just not that fluent in it all. So we'll try to connect the twos. Nothing to install or update. So what I've found locally is sometimes I need to add this dev flag, and I don't know why.
Are you sure you're running this from the same directory that your composer.json file's in?
Oh yeah, no, I'm in a totally different directory, aren't I?
Because it should definitely give you some kind of error or something about that new dependency.
Yeah, so I'm probably in the wrong folder now. Default. We're in the default project. No, I'm not in. CD default project. Okay, and then I need to. That's where the composer file is, and then I need to point to the plugin. I need to point to here, which might be in a different location at the moment. So how do I find that? I need to go up what? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that should work, I think. Okay.
So then what was the dependency that you were trying to add through path repo?
So I included Sprout Reports.
So take a look at, now that here's the tricky thing, is to determine whether your path repo worked or not. If you look at the output of your composer update command for Sprout Reports, it did not symlink it.
It says downloading.
Yeah, look at bottom one. It's cloning from cache.
Yes, so, this one. Oh, I'm glad. I struggled trying to think how I could create this problem for this Hangout, and here I just have done it.
There you go. So, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. Like, I have not fully digested how Composer's path repo resolution works, and when it would go with a path repo versus something that's available through cache or through Packagist. What I've found is the easiest way to get it to kind of force a path repo to connect and symlink from that, rather than going to Packagist, is to like increase the version of your plugin's composer.json file, and to explicitly require that version, like a version that's not available on Packagist yet.
Okay, so okay. Now, can we talk about this error a little bit more, though? I believe the error here is that the plugins.php file, I've found that it has something.
There's no error here. I mean, it's okay. The only problem is that it grabbed the plugin from the wrong place.
Okay.
You were hoping it would grab it from the path repo and create a symlink, but instead it actually, hard downloaded it to your vendor folder or cloned it. In this case, it happened to already have a copy of that in cache. But the only reason it would have cared about that is if it had already determined that whatever was on Packagist was the thing to use. I'm not totally sure whether adding @dev is the right move or not.
I will not speak to it authoritatively. It solved the problem a couple times for me and clearly did not work in this instance. So I mean,
that's basically all you're basically doing there is you're telling Composer you want whatever like the latest dev version of the dependency is, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to use what the path repo has. It's going to, Packagist itself knows what knows about like your different Git branches and stuff like that. So in this case, it looks like it just grabbed the latest commit from what it considers to be a development branch of your repo.
Okay, so in this case, I've now updated my version to 8, which isn't available anywhere but locally.
Yeah.
And I will tell Composer, I have too many of these files open, I think. We'll update this to require 8. Would you do tilde or anything, or you just be specific?
Yeah, you don't need to. You could just leave it hard-coded.
Right, and then I guess I now need to remove report.
No, not in this case. The only time you have to worry about that is if it was already a path repo. But in this case, it's not. It's not symlinked. It's cloned, so it should actually get updated correctly.
And essentially just overwrite that folder with the.
Yeah, it should detect. Oh, where do I find this 1.0.0-beta 8? And here we go. You can see it's removing Sprout reports, and then it's reinstalling it and symlinking from the folder where it found it.
Okay, that's great. Exactly.
So yeah, and again, like I wish I could tell you with more authority why it chose to use Packagist instead of the symlink the first time around, when they both should have, satisfied the constraints that you have.
Yeah. So I think so. Then the next question here, and this is probably a little specific to my scenario, is it did not symlink Sprout base, which is a ye module dependency we have in local development as well. So, well, again, I haven't required it specifically here, but it is a dependency on Sprout reports. So
again, that's like another thing. You could just choose to explicitly require some version of it that doesn't exist on Packagist from your own composer.json file. You can do that without needing to modify Sprout reports, as long as.
And me doing so, I'm kind of breaking the recursiveness of Composer in my local dev environment by requiring Sprout Brace at the top level, but I'm essentially getting the same result of both plugins installed in a way.
Yeah, so when Composer is trying to resolve dependencies, it's going to factor in your project's dependencies as well as all your dependencies and try and find some kind of common strain. So assuming that your Sprout Reports plugin has an open-ended requirement for Sprout Core, in that there's a caret involved in there, or there's a tilde or something, and then the version that you specify in the composer.json on Sprout Core and in here, as long as that kind of is compatible with whatever Sprout Reports is requiring, then it should just start doing the same thing. It should go for loading the path repo rather than packages.
Okay. Now, if folks want to do a more command line version of this, I flip back and forth. I'm not very consistent. I kind of visually understand adding it to this array and running Composer update better. But if we wanted to do that same thing from the command line, we could type Composer, remove, and then the package name. And that will get rid of the package from our repo. Maybe.
Looks like you missed a dash in Sprout Reports.
Yes. All right.
So that's gone, and then
gets rid of it from here.
The one thing to note is it did remove it from your require config, but it did not remove the path repo. Obviously, like that's still there.
Okay.
So then the key is, like, once you have it in the path, once you have that path repository defined, then yeah, you can from terminal. You don't have to include it directly from composer.json. You could go to terminal and type, composer require barrel strength / Sprout -reports : and then type in the version number, the constraint that you want to use, and then click enter, and that'll give you the same result as you would have gotten the other way around.
And like nicely, we're symlinking again, and we actually got the symlink of the other dependency there too. So that actually is a solution to something I run into frequently here. So
there you go.
Great. Okay, so that's handy, and I can attest to it being handy. I can't tell you how many times I've bothered Brandon or Brad or somebody over at P&T for some issue because I haven't fully understood these things. So
we don't either. So
I think of it as I'm contributing to the development of the documentation for other people.
Mm-hmm.
So. All right. Well, I think I'm gonna say let's wrap it up here. There's a couple more items on my list, but they might be best broken out for another time. I had testing plugin migrations and kind of understanding the workflow with Composer and plugin migrations, and kind of testing what happens when you are debugging somebody else's database and they give you a database full of things in it that you don't have installed locally.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's actually, yeah, I mean, well, that we could tie that into this real quick,
okay,
because
yeah,
we obviously deal with that a lot, and that's one of those things where this composer-based setup has really come in handy, because now, if you really need to like try and reproduce someone's bug and you just can't do it, oftentimes, not if you get not just the database, but if you also get their composer.lock file and their composer.json file, then you can get those in, and you can run composer install, and you're going to get all of their the plugins that they have. They're all going to show up locally.
very nice.
And you don't need to like worry about like, do I have the right version of this? Do I have the right version of that? By getting that composer.lock file, you're going to have exactly the same code on your system as they have on theirs, which is really handy for debugging customer issues.
Yeah, that is really nice. My initial attempts at it were to install the database and go through disabling plugins I didn't have.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you get that composer.lock file and you run composer install, then you don't have to do that anymore. It's just you're running their system at that point. Essentially.
So add the composer files to the list to request support stuff.
Yeah, it definitely is a time saver, especially, as long as they're not using a bunch of packages that aren't publicly available. There is that chance. There is, I don't know if we didn't touch on packagist.com, but there is, in addition to packagist.org, there's also packagist.com, and that's, called private Packagist. And that's kind of a way for you to very easily maintain like a Packagist repository for packages that you're not interested in releasing publicly. They're on private repos perhaps, and you just want like internally for your organization to have a way to centrally install your own packages for your own internal projects. So obviously, if you had anything like that where it's on a private GitHub repo and they were installing it through this, then that's not going to work in those cases. Like, you're not going to get that code installed. But for the vast majority of projects where all of the requirements of the project are publicly available, it is really nice and easy.
Great. We have one more question from Jan. Question: symlinking repos, is that the go-to way to install a project plugin that isn't on Packagist or any other repo than the current one?
This actually, yeah, I think when you get into like project plugins,
Jan, can you clarify, do you mean Yi module by that?
I think he's referring to like, yeah, to Yi modules,
or just a business logic plugin,
which is kind of it's like kind of the Craft, like, so Craft 2, you'd have a lot of sites that would have these like project specific plugins, and in Craft 3, if you were to want a project specific plugin, then yeah, you'd need to do either a path repo or use private Packagist or some other way of making those plugins available to other internal developers. The Craft 3 way of doing a project plugin is probably to do a module and to write that like just as part of the source code of the project itself, in which case it's not really something that you need to worry about distributing privately or publicly. It's just you distribute it alongside your template files and your config files and everything else that's just part of your project. That's definitely a topic for a different hangout.
So now, yeah, let's take it in the context of, say, a project plugin then, and say I have a small business logic plugin that needs some setting in the control panel UI, so I've decided to make it a plugin.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to put it publicly for everything. I just want it in my project. How do I manage that alongside?
Yeah, so you could, I mean, basically, yeah, the answers are either use path repos, use private packagist, create your own. There's Composer's documentation actually lists like 5 or 7 different ways that you can manage private packages. Private packages being like the preferred way for the most part, because it is really, they really do simplify things with this. It's pretty nice.
No, the way not to do it is the Craft 2 way, which is create your plugin and dump it in the vendor folder under a folder that you're calling your business name or something like that.
Well, I mean, like it would end up there if you did it as a plugin, but you wouldn't have that be where you're developing it in the way that, and the Craft 2 way would have been to just create it within the plugins folder and commit it with the rest of your stuff. Which, again, like you're still welcome to like commit your vendor folder if you feel more comfortable doing it that way. I would say
like, the remove vendor folder stuff, you'd also be deleting your plugin completely and it wouldn't be coming back.
Yeah, so probably not the best move. I would say like if it really is code that's only going to be used for that one project, don't do it as a plugin, do it as a module. Build that module code directly into your source folder on your project. We should definitely have that be a follow-up talk on another day.
It would be nice a targeted simple E module development, because they are very flexible, and you can do control panel settings. You can do control.
Anything you can do as a plugin, you can do as a module that's like specific to that project. If like taking a slightly different direction, if you had a private plugin, if you have code you need to use across multiple websites, but you still want it to be internal, in that case, whether you do it as a plugin or a module, like a module doesn't need to be part of a craft project. Like you could have it as a dependency, just like other plugins are. So whichever route you go, you'd probably want to find a good way to keep that distributed for your team. And private packagist, packagist.com is probably the simplest way to do that. It does cost a little bit of money. I forget what, you may be looking at $10 or $15 a month to be able to use that. But if you're working in a collaborative environment with other developers, it's totally going to be worth it.
Great. Well, let's wrap up on that. And I think we have plenty of topics we've touched on that we could do follow-up things on. I've got a long list with Craft 3 here, so we're going to start off with a handful of the developer topics, and then we'll get into some of the more new cool features like the new image editing tools and the multi-site functionality. Trying to start with topics that are real pain points for people in the community and potentially support problems for Craft, not problems, but like places where Craft receives a lot of support, because if we can all get better at these things and give them less support, they can give us all a cooler product with all the extra time they have on their hands. So
that's true.
We appreciate you joining us for these, Brandon, and sharing your wisdom. And this will be up on the Straight Up Hangouts YouTube channel and on Straight Up Craft site shortly after this. And I will do my best to break it into a few smaller pieces for those who might want to watch a shorter segment of it later. So thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Thanks a lot, Ben.
Until next time, craft the planet.